Good morning. So, Peter Boghossian, he was, I think, a philosophy professor at Portland State, and had some other kind of intellectual dark web interactions. If you're not familiar, I'll try and remember to link to his Twitter, and you can kind of look at some of the things he says. But interesting fellow, and he posed the question, what is a problem that is not systemic? Can you give an example of a problem that's not systemic? And I thought it was an interesting question, and I actually sat and thought about the question for a while, trying to come up with an example. And I mean, there's obviously a few different ways that you can look at the question, and some of what you might come up with as an answer is going to kind of depend on how you define your terms. You could look at it, when you say a system, right, something with kind of a rigid structure or set of rules, and specifically when we talk about systemic problems, what people are referring to are things like patriarchy or, systemic racism, or heteronormative culture, whatever the dominant culture or power structure is, which is generally speaking kind of a Marxist frame of view of the world, right? If we go back to Marx and Sociology 101, we're talking about power and structure, right? What are these structures in society that govern how things work, and how does the dominant culture exercise power over those structures to exploit whatever minority group you want to look at. When you talk about intersectionality, it's how do you have convergence of exploitation or discrimination on the basis of whatever immutable characteristics, plural, right? Race, gender, ethnicity, sexual orientation, gender identity, whatever it is, right? And so if you look at the question that way, then, I mean, if we're being kind of, practical about it, and we're talking about, social systems or, corporate systems or government systems or whatever systems, that we're generally talking about as systemic problems, I mean, then you can say things that are like kind of, acts of nature or acts of God, like getting hit by a lightning bolt, or twisting your ankle, or, whatever thing, it's not really a systemic problem. It's more of a localized phenomenon, right? You can play this game, and I've done this before, and there's others who have. I'm not the first. But I mean, just take anything, right? And I mean literally anything, and plug it into the Google machine and ask the question, is blank racist, for example? And you will inevitably find one or more, opinion articles or something, generally on the topic of that and how it is racist, right? Which, that's not a new idea, but I guess asking more broadly, give an example of a problem that's not systemic. And I think you ultimately, if you look at the world through a Marxist lens, through the lens of power and structure, and, oppressed and oppressor, then everything is a systemic problem, right? If I twisted my ankle, then, I mean, there's a variety of, oppressive factors that led to the systemic situation in which I was prone to twist my ankle, whether it's, body shaming, and I'm more prone to twist my ankle, or I live in a neighborhood which has, poor maintenance of sidewalks and streets, and the ground is more uneven, or is even unpaved, and so I'm, oppressed by gentrification, or, income inequality or, redlining and whatever other factors that led to me living in a place where I was more likely to twist my ankle and then suffer the consequences of, unequal access to medical care, or being struck by lightning, if you're a houseless individual, or more likely to be out in the elements, or you're a working class person who's, compelled to work out in the elements rather than, a cushy white collar job indoors where you are not going to be struck by lightning while you are being oppressed by an unfair economic system or class structure or whatever else, right? And you can play this game with everything, right? Or at least that's how the arguments could go. And so that's why I found myself struggling with this for so long, and I literally could not find an example of a problem that would be experienced by a human being who lives within the context of a social structure, right? A systemic social context that would not, arguably be a systemic problem, right? And so that being the case, then what can we conclude about people pointing out and railing against quote-unquote systemic problems as opposed to problems, right? And why make the distinction? And is the distinction even useful? And I think that's kind of what Peter Boghossian's, inferring by asking the question, without trying to play mind-reading games. I think that's kind of what he's driving at by asking the question, right? Like, what do we gain by making the distinction about systemic problems versus just problems, right? And to be sure, there are certainly instances where there are social ills because we have inflicted injury on ourselves as human beings in the way we have, ordered our society, right? If you live in North Korea versus South Korea, then the fact that you live in North Korea means that due to the systems, right, the power structures in place under, the regime in which you are living, you're going to experience significantly more problems on average than an individual who lives in South Korea, right? So that's clearly a systemic problem. But what do we gain by calling that a systemic problem, right? Rather than just, authoritarian regimes are a problem, right? And does that somehow better inform our understanding of the suffering of people under totalitarian regimes by calling it a systemic problem rather than just unjust, right? Or evil, ultimately, right? And that's just an extreme example, but you bring it back to something more pedestrian. And again, the context in which I operate so often is law enforcement and, how law enforcement interacts with various groups in society. And law enforcement is definitely a structure, right, within society. It is an institution, right? And so the way that law enforcement is structured or organized and the rules in which it operates, that system affects how people live. And law enforcement in one country versus another can be more or less detrimental to the welfare of the people living in that country. And certainly, law enforcement in North Korea is probably, again, not preferable to law enforcement in most Western industrialized nations, right? But, that said, when you look at a specific interaction between an officer and an individual, right? is that really a systemic problem? And I've made this point before, right? When we talk about, on the one hand, the broad statistical trends or outcomes, right? And that is very clearly more a systemic issue versus the outcome in a particular interaction with all the kind of narrowly granular specificity of that particular incident, right? All the facts and events and things that happened leading up to that particular incident, whichever it may be. And I've talked about a few of them. You can go back and look at those videos and look at the context of those particular things and ask yourself, how much of what happened here, say in the mall shooting in Houston that I talked about, where the guy got up like a zombie after he'd been shot several times, how much of that is a systemic problem, right? Now, I mean, that person has certain demographic attributes, and it falls into one category when you look at the broader rates of behavior, for people in that demographic group and how they interact with police. So, I mean, there is certainly some overlap there. And to be sure, the rules that govern law enforcement had an effect on the outcome of that interaction, for good or for ill, right? But when a person makes decisions, how much agency do they actually have, right? How much control over the choices that they make do they actually have, right? And I think that's kind of the central kernel of calling something a systemic problem or not, right? Is whether or not we're talking about factors beyond our control in a broad system versus the narrow and specific events, interpersonal interactions in which we have agency as individuals, right? And how often, how much, to what degree does an individual have responsibility for their own decision making, right? Do you view the world in such a way in which individuals actually have agency, right? Do people have free will? Are they responsible for the choices that they make? There are determinists out there who say free will is an illusion. We don't actually have free will, right? Everything is sort of just kind of ultimately a Newtonian outcome. It's physics. It's atoms bumping into each other like billiard balls on a billiard table, and it's just a highly complex system, and so it looks mysterious to us, but these outcomes are all predetermined, and you don't actually have free will. And if that's the case, right, then yeah, everything's a systemic problem, right? Because you're not responsible for your own actions. You don't have agency, and the choices you make are not really your own, and you're just a victim of whatever circumstances befall you, and you react in whatever predetermined way that chemistry and physics determines you will do. Now, if you want to believe in that kind of universe, I mean, you're certainly welcome to. But that is not how we have structured our society. We have structured our society based upon the premise that people actually do have agency, right? They are in control of their thoughts and feelings and decisions. And when they do something like attack somebody else, they are responsible for their own actions, right? And so if you want to call something a systemic problem based upon a specific example of how something occurred, then you've got to kind of parse out, again, to what degree is this a function of the broader system that the person is living in? Are they a victim of circumstance? Or did they make a choice that resulted in an outcome, right? And it's never going to be all one or the other. I mean, again, you can always play that game and say that everything is systemic. And certainly you can also turn that around and say, humans have free will, they could have done X, Y, and Z. You could always Sunday quarterback things and say they should have done this, they should have done that. All this could have been different if they just made different choices. But, if we're going to look narrowly at one instance and choices were made, then you have to kind of decide if you're going to, take the assumptions, the basic assumptions of society about humans actually having agency and be responsible for their actions. If you make that assumption, and you have to then look at these situations, and if people are making choices in the heat of the moment, right, in an event, not looking at what happened before, both the choices they made and to get there, and the circumstances of their birth, but just what happened in that particular instance, and there were choices made, right? If someone exercised agency, then you kind of have to assign responsibility for those choices to that individual, or so it would seem to me. But that's just my opinion. What do you think? Do humans have agency? Do we have free will? Are we really just predetermined through physics and chemistry to behave in certain ways? Is everything a systemic problem? Or is that a meaningful distinction? Is that helpful? Let me know. Drop a comment below. Like, comment, subscribe, share the video if you think it's interesting. It's been fun, inspiring, and uplifting as always. We'll see you on the next one.